This program is brought to you by Ground News.
This is Howard W. Campbell Jr. He's a fictional character from my favorite book, Mother Night by Kurt Vonnegut, who served as an American spy during the Second World War. He eventually took up a position as a Nazi propagandist who stirred up racist fervor about the genocide. But the thing was, his heart wasn't really in it. He was an undercover American spy, remember? Without spoiling the book, his role as a propagandist for a genocide served its purpose, regardless of what his real intentions had been. He facilitated the spread of dangerous misinformation, defended the indefensible, and inspired the unimaginable. At the end of the day, it didn't matter whether or not he believed in what he was saying. The outcome was the same. I think there's a parallel to be made between this fictional character and the behavior we've seen from those who occupy positions in the media today. From the corporate outlets who, for one reason or another, defend or minimize the brutality of the Israeli state. Maybe their funding sources don't permit an anti-Zionist stance. Maybe they're genuinely ideologically in line with Israel. To more niche internet creators who, whether it be due to audience capture and spite, or shady funding sources that would rather they not talk about the genocide. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter if they're genuine or not. The outcome remains. In my last video, I set out to refute common Zionist arguments about the formation of the State of Israel and other historical talking points. This time, I want to do the same thing, but focus on more contemporary arguments. It's not uncommon to hear Zionist claims that there is actually no genocide or apartheid in Palestine, that Hamas steals aid and uses human shields, that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and that Palestinian textbooks teach kids to hate. We'll go over all of these lies and more and refute them. Parsing through and reading about these contentious topics can be time-consuming and draining, and it's hard to know who's even giving you the full picture. That's why I've been using Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. They're a website and app that show you how a story is being covered across the political spectrum, so you can quickly spot which outlets are pushing a narrative and which ones are ignoring things altogether. And each story comes with a visual breakdown on things like the source's political bias, their factuality, and ownership details. Taking a look at this story about a UN-backed hunger monitor declaring famine in Gaza City, it's pretty easy to see which side of the political spectrum cares to promote it. Headlines on the left tend to use more accusatory language, highlighting the devastation caused by Israel, while headlines on the right often read as cold and calculated. Most of the coverage is also coming from outlets to the left of center, with only a few right-leaning outlets picking it up, making this a blind spot for the right. Ground News has a blind spot feed that surfaces stories disproportionately covered by one side, so you can spot conversations your usual outlets might miss. Stories exactly like this one. It's because of this that I got you all 40% off the same Vantage plan I've been using. Just go to groundnews.com/over, use the QR code here on screen, or click the link below to get started for under $6 a month. Now let's get back to the video. Why don't the other Arab countries take in the Palestinians?
Why won't Arab states around Gaza take in Palestinian refugees?
The fact that the Arabs won't take in the Palestinians, you can't even bring that up.
It may not seem like it at first glance, but this talking point and the refutation of it are layered and multifaceted, so bear with me as I deconstruct it from multiple angles. This argument relies on a monolithic understanding of Arabs and ignores the fact that Palestinians prior to Zionism developed their own distinct customs, dialects, and rituals. They engaged in forms of agricultural work unique to them and specialized in cultivating specific products, citrus being a very notable one. In fact, the Jaffa orange, known as the Shamoudi, was such an incredible feat due to its resilience in the face of disease and rot, its thick peel, aroma, and sweetness that it easily outperformed its competitors like Italian and Spanish oranges. To cultivate such a crop, the Palestinians adopted advanced irrigation methods and techniques to combat the harsh desert climate and properly nourish their orchards. This, by the way, also refutes another common Zionist talking point, being that Palestinians were feeble and unable to work the land of Palestine until the Zionists arrived with their superior intelligence and green thumbs and made the desert bloom. In actuality, the Zionists engaged in plenty of reckless destruction and notable instances of negligence when it came to the way they interacted with the land. They deliberately dismantled vestiges of Palestinian and Levantine life. They replaced the local agriculture and crops with ones imported from Europe to make the country feel less Middle Eastern and more accommodating to the European colonizers, and they planted imported foreign greenery over the ruins of Palestinian villages and centers under the guise of environmentalism. As to be expected, this Zionist-induced ecocide had horrific ramifications, like wildfires caused by the imported pine and eucalyptus trees, which are thirsty trees by nature and consequently dried up the land, along with environmental degradation and more. It doesn't take a genius to know that plopping a bunch of invasive species into a region might cause some issues. As for the remaining Palestinian citrus industry, the Zionists crafted a narrative in which they took credit for it. As Mustafa Kaba and Nahum Karlinsky wrote in their book, The Lost Orchard, citriculture is presented as the economic power that propelled the Israeli economy forward, as it was Israel's major export industry in the first decades after the state was established. This meta-narrative erroneously presents the citrus industry as a Jewish Zionist industry, mythically created ex nihilo by the hegemonic labor Zionist movement, echoing the Zionist tenet of making the desert bloom. Needless to say, this meta-narrative does not even mention Palestinian citriculture. Now you might be wondering why I'm talking about Palestinian oranges and what this has to do with the point, but the reason I bring all of this up here is to highlight the absurdity of demanding that a people with their own unique ways of life in relationship to their land, history, agricultural practices, and their distinct aspirations for self-determination be forced to uproot and move to another country simply because it also happens to be Arab majority. Aside from all this, the Zionist argument that Palestinians should just move to another Arab country and that the surrounding Arab countries should embrace them stems from the long-standing Zionist conception of transfer. In Zionist parlance, transfer, or transferring the Palestinians, has always been a euphemism for ethnic cleansing. As Palestinian historian Noor Mashallah explains in his book Expulsion of the Palestinians, David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Zionist settler movement in Palestine before Israel was created, was no stranger to this linguistic sleight of hand. Ben-Gurion even wrote to his son that he had no qualms about expelling the Arabs and taking their place. He wasn't great at keeping it a secret. Benny Morris, a prominent liberal Zionist historian who is no friend of the Palestinians in my view, also sheds light on the inherently genocidal nature of Zionism. In the revisited edition of his book, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, he wrote, "Transfer was inevitable and inbuilt into Zionism because it sought to transform a land which was Arab into a Jewish state, and a Jewish state could not have arisen without a major displacement of Arab population. The existence of a Jewish state necessitates a Jewish demographic majority alongside a legal and military apparatus to uphold it. That's why any Jew born anywhere in the world is immediately eligible to move to Palestine under the 1950 Law of Return, while Palestinians born in Palestine, or descendants of those ethnically cleansed in 1948, are not offered the same. So with all of that said, there is an understanding not only among Palestinians, many of whom see capitulating to Zionist demands as surrendering to their colonial oppressors, but also among the surrounding Arab countries. On one hand, they don't want an influx of refugees, if for no other reason than economic concerns. On the other hand, they recognize that Israel's goal from the very beginning, as openly admitted by the leading figures of the Zionist movement, has been transfer, meaning the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians from their land. Not to mention the fact that just because the leaders of the states neighboring Israel may be Arab, that doesn't mean they have the Palestinians' best intentions at heart. In fact, many surrounding Arab leaders, largely in defiance of the wishes of their citizenry, have effectively turned their backs on the Palestinians long, long ago. King Abdullah of then Transjordan, for instance, turned his back on the Palestinians before the State of Israel was ever even formed. He was actually involved in backroom secret deals with the Zionists. As Israeli historian Ilan Pape put it, it was with Britain's knowledge and tacit consent that King Abdullah came to an informal agreement with the Zionist leadership. If some of the Palestinian Arab territories were annexed to Transjordan, he would do his best to stand back from the Arab League's opposition to partition. This was music to the Zionists' ears. In 1947, it was evident that an attempt to take over Palestine by force could prompt a formidable military reaction from the Arab world. The Zionist leadership needed a way to undermine the Arab military effort from the outset. The Arab Legion, Jordan's state army, was the most efficient army in the Arab world. Neutralizing this army, or even limiting its participation, would make it much easier for Zionists to transform Palestine into a Jewish state. Iraqi-Israeli historian Avi Shleim details these secret relations between the Zionists and King Abdullah extensively in his 1988 book, Collusions Across the Jordan. He sheds light on Abdullah's desire for the lands within Palestine, his ambition to create a greater Syria under Hashemite rule, and his willingness to strike a deal with the Zionists to achieve those goals. But King Abdullah was far from the only Arab leader to turn his back on the Palestinians. The Gulf monarchies of today have done so long ago, largely due to the fact that they have billions of dollars invested in the West, and Israel is constantly paraded around as a Western ally. These Gulf states have been cooperating with Israel in security, diplomatic, and economic sectors despite their population's disapproval. Beyond the obvious economic incentives, Israel and these Gulf states also share a common regional adversary, Iran. This betrayal of the Palestinians by Arab leaders stands in direct contradiction to the will of their citizens, who, for the most part, remain steadfast allies of the Palestinian cause. That's why these leaders typically pay lip service to Palestinian solidarity, even though many of them sold them out long ago. Saudi Arabia, for instance, still hasn't formally normalized relations with Israel, yet they work together when it comes to security, business, and intelligence sharing. Saudi leadership understands that this behavior is opposed by the Saudi population, so they largely deal with Israel secretly. Egypt is another clear example of a government normalizing relations with the Zionist entity while the vast majority of its people stand firmly with the Palestinians. A 2007 Pew Research Center poll found that 93% of Egyptians support the Palestinians over the Israelis. Reporting from 2012 shows that 61% of Egyptians wanted to annul the 1979 peace treaty with Israel, and a 2013 report found that 92% held unfavorable views of Israel. That same year, a Washington Institute poll showed that 97% of Egyptians demanded a complete severing of all diplomatic, economic, and political ties with Israel. Yet, despite this overwhelming public sentiment, Egyptian leadership largely ignores the masses while continuing to benefit as one of the largest recipients of U.S. aid every year. Maybe that has something to do with it. These Arab governments that normalize relations with Israel against the wishes of their own people inevitably resort to authoritarian measures to silence dissent over both Israel's crimes and their own complicity. Clearly, treating Arabs as some monolithic hive mind who can be geographically swapped around to serve the interests of the colonizers is a ridiculous argument that would never be applied to any other group. Now, even if we set aside everything I've said up until this point, accepting the Zionist argument that Palestinians should just move to other Arab countries while those countries are expected to absorb them is literally conceding to ethnic cleansing. When it comes to the Palestinian plight, the UN explicitly calls for the opposite. In 1948, after the Zionists massacred and ethnically cleansed the Palestinians, the UNGA issued Resolution 194, which stated that Palestinians who were expelled should be allowed to return to their land and property as soon as possible, or be compensated for what they lost if they so choose. This right has been ignored by the Zionists, and now they call for the displacement of even more Palestinians into neighboring countries. Once you grasp the long-standing Israeli goal of transferring, that is, expelling, as many Palestinians as possible to secure a Jewish demographic majority, it becomes clear why the Zionists keep hammering this line of argument and why the Palestinians continue to resist in the face of such unadulterated barbarism. As Pape wrote, given the UN commitment to the right of return for refugees, refugees did not accept citizenship elsewhere, nor did they build new homes in their host countries. They did not want to imply that they were reconciled to their dispossession. There is no genocide in Gaza. It's common to hear Zionists deny genocide when discussing Israel's offensive in Gaza. They often make arguments like, genocide is when the population decreases, which, by the way, is happening in Gaza. We'll touch on that later. If Israel wanted to commit genocide, they would have wiped out all the Palestinians by now. Or, it can't be genocide if Palestinians are giving birth. All of these claims, however, are either fundamental misunderstandings or deliberate obfuscations of what genocide actually is and how it's defined under the Genocide Convention. According to Article 2 of the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, genocide is any of these acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. There are two main components to this definition: the prohibited acts, known as the actus reus, and the specific mental state of the perpetrator, the special intent, or dolo specialis. The 5 prohibited acts include killing members of the group, which is self-explanatory, causing serious bodily or mental harm encompassing severe physical injury, psychological trauma, or sexual violence, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction, in whole or in part, such as sieges, starvation, or the destruction of healthcare and sanitation systems, imposing measures intended to prevent births, including causing miscarriages or denying adequate access to maternal healthcare, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group, which severs the group's connection to its future generations and constitutes cultural and biological erasure. With this definition in mind, it becomes clear that genocide is a highly specific crime that can occur without the death of a single victim. If one or more of the prohibited acts is committed with the special intent to destroy the group, in whole or in part, it qualifies as a genocidal act. So right off the bat, anyone claiming that genocide requires mass death is not just oversimplifying, they're flat out incorrect. Now this is where things get tricky and where Zionist genocide deniers often try to defend Israel. Genocide, as we've mentioned, requires a highly specific special intent on the part of the perpetrator to destroy a group in whole or in part. But what if that intent isn't explicitly confessed, stated, or openly declared? What then? Proving someone's mindset can be a significant challenge, so how is it determined? Well, international jurisprudence and legal precedent largely developed by the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and for Rwanda, the ICTR, provide a method to infer intent. For example, the ICTR has outlined several indicators suggesting a deliberate intent to destroy a particular group. These include the broader context of related wrongful acts systematically targeting the same group, the severity and scale of the offenses, the intentional selection of victims based on their group affiliation, the underlying political ideology driving the acts, the use of demeaning or hostile language toward the group, and more. Additionally, the careful and organized manner in which these destructive actions are carried out is regarded as compelling evidence of the perpetrator's specific intent. Now, if we take the definition of genocide I've just outlined, one or more of the prohibited acts committed with a special intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, and combine it with the established jurisprudence used to infer intent, the situation in Gaza becomes strikingly clear. So let's do that now. As noted in an Amnesty International report titled, "You Feel Like You're Subhuman, Israel's Genocide in Gaza," Israel's pattern of conduct is clearly indicative of genocidal intent. Israel repeatedly carries out indiscriminate attacks on civilians, often striking at night while families are asleep and killing them all. It uses wide area effect weapons in densely populated neighborhoods, destroying homes, health facilities, sanitation systems, religious sites, and more. Even after taking control of an area, when it can no longer blame Hamas, Israel continues these attacks. It repeatedly displaces Palestinians under inhumane conditions, subjects them to torture and arbitrary detention, and blocks adequate humanitarian relief. We've already hit almost all of the prohibited acts, and we're far from done. According to the same Amnesty report, Israel's siege has left babies malnourished because their mothers lacked proper nutrition, making it difficult to produce breast milk, while also restricting adequate amounts of baby formula from entering the Gaza Strip. Israel has further failed to uphold its obligations under international law by not allowing unimpeded humanitarian aid, resulting in inadequate maternal care and numerous other consequences. And no, it's not Hamas that's systematically intercepting this aid, as we will cover in a later segment. The responsibility lies squarely with Israel for failing to abide by international law. All of this has culminated in the UN reporting that Gaza is facing catastrophic birth outcomes, with just 17,000 recorded births in the first half of 2025, a staggering 41% decline in Gaza's birth rate over the past 3 years. Clearly, the actus reus, the prohibited acts outlined in the Genocide Convention, are being carried out. The next step is establishing Israeli intent. As I've mentioned, you don't need a smoking gun or an explicit confession from the perpetrator. The framework developed by international jurisprudence allows for a reasonable inference of intent based on the broader context of the wrongful acts targeting a group, dehumanizing language towards the group, and more. Recall the ICTR document I showed you earlier. Importantly, genocidal intent doesn't have to be the sole motive behind an action. Courts have made it clear that genocidal intent can exist alongside other objectives, such as military goals or political advantage. So, when you hear Zionists say that Israel is conducting war, not genocide, remind them that the two are not mutually exclusive. The Bosnian genocide, where 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were killed in Srebrenica, occurred within the broader Yugoslav wars. The fact that this took place within the context of a war doesn't preclude it from being considered a genocide. Now, in the case of the Israeli genocide of the Palestinians in Gaza, we actually do have instances of Israeli officials making it incredibly easy to gauge their genocidal aspirations. So when it comes to making inferences, it's not that hard to do. On October 9th, 2023, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced a complete siege of Gaza, stating that we are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. He then spelled out the policy. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel, everything is closed. This dehumanizing language isn't merely provocative, it carries legal weight. By labeling Gaza's population as human animals, Gallant's words suggest the mental element, or mens rea, for the concurrent policy of collective punishment and starvation, which constitutes a prohibited act of genocide. Specifically, the the deliberate creation of living conditions intended to cause physical destruction. His statement frames the siege and starvation as a justified response to the group as a whole, demonstrating intent to harm Palestinians themselves, not just Hamas combatants. This aligns with jurisprudence from the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which explicitly identifies the use of dehumanizing and derogatory language as a factor in inferring genocidal intent. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu openly invoked the story of Amalek as his troops invaded Gaza, directly referencing the biblical command for genocidal annihilation. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich also alluded to this well-known genocidal biblical narrative. Israeli President Isaac Herzog held the entire Palestinian population of Gaza responsible for October 7th, stating, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved." Meanwhile, Minister of National Security Itamar Ben-Gvir explicitly conflated ordinary Palestinians with Hamas and called for their destruction, saying, "When they say that Hamas needs to be eliminated, it also means those who sing, those who support, and those who distribute sweets. All of these are terrorists, and they should be eliminated." These are not random Israelis voicing extremist opinions. They are the highest-ranking officials in the Israeli government: the Prime Minister, the President, the Finance Minister, and the Minister of National Security. That's not normal. This dehumanizing language, the severity and scale of destruction, and the methods employed are all key indicators used to infer intent. Remember, when making such an inference, it's important to view the situation holistically, including the lead up to October 7th and the years of subjugation and ethnic cleansing that Palestinians have endured. The fact that Zionists still deny that this is genocide is laughable, especially given the countless human rights organizations, UN bodies, and genocide scholars that say otherwise. These include but are not limited to Amnesty International, Euromed Monitor, Doctors Without Borders, UN Special Committees, Human Rights Watch, and even Israeli human rights organizations like B'Tselem and Physicians for Human Rights Israel. Raz Segal, a scholar of Holocaust and genocide studies, called Israel's actions, quote, "a textbook case of genocide unfolding in front of our eyes," as early as October 2023. Holocaust historian Omar Bartov, who served in the IDF and long defended Israel by framing its actions as mere human rights violations, has since reversed his position, stating that he now believes Israel is indeed committing genocide. And on September 1st, 2025, 86% of the members of the International Association of Genocide Scholars who participated in a vote supported a resolution stating that Israel is in fact committing genocide under the definition provided by the Genocide Convention. For those who like to throw out half-baked rebuttals, such as, if Israel is committing genocide, they're really bad at it since they haven't killed everyone, or if Israel wanted to, they could have wiped out everyone in Gaza, let me share a quick excerpt from the aforementioned Amnesty International report that addresses this argument. It's not a requirement that a perpetrator select or pursue the most efficient method of destroying the targeted group. The ICTY appeals chamber has held that, even where the method selected will not implement the perpetrator's intent to the fullest, leaving that destruction incomplete, this ineffectiveness alone does not preclude a finding of genocidal intent. As the appeals chamber further recognized, international pressure may prevent the perpetrator of a genocidal plan from putting it into action in the most direct and efficient way, and compel them instead to adopt the method which would allow them to implement the genocidal design while minimizing the risk of retribution.
Israel, with their complete air superiority, certainly would have had the ability to commit full-scale human atrocities had they wanted to.
We need to remember that Israel, despite its long history of defying international law, still has to at least try to appear compliant. Another common catchword on the matter is, if it's genocide, then why are Palestinian birth rates high? Shouldn't the population be decreasing? Well, contrary to what your typical Zionist Twitter user tells you about a supposed 2% increase in Gaza's population since October 2023, this is false. That 2% figure comes from projections based on pre-October 7th data, specifically from August 2023. In reality, Gaza's population has been declining, with a study published in The Lancet showing a dramatic drop in life expectancy. Remember, official or mainstream death tolls are almost certainly huge, massive undercounts. Countless bodies remain buried under the rubble, and scholarly estimates suggest that the real number is much, much higher. Israel is the only democracy in the region. Israel likes to pretend like it's the only democracy in the Middle East, but as Ilan Pape pointed out, that this held true only for its Jewish population did not trouble its conscience too much. He reminds us that the litmus test of any democracy is the level of tolerance it is willing to extend toward the minorities living in it. In this respect, Israel falls short of being a true democracy. For example, after the new territorial gains, several laws were passed ensuring a superior position for the majority. The laws governing citizenship, the laws concerning land ownership, and most importantly, the law of return. The latter grants automatic citizenship to every Jew in the world, wherever he or she was born. This law, in particular, is a flagrantly undemocratic one, for it was accompanied by the total rejection of the Palestinian right of return, denying people the right of return to their homeland after they were ethnically cleansed, and at the same time offering this right to others who have no connection to the land, is a model of undemocratic practice. See, the purported democracy that exists in Israel is designed to serve the interests of Jews alone. As the 2018 nation-state law affirms, the State of Israel is for Jews to exercise their right to self-determination, and this right is only available for Jews. In addition to this, the law considers Jewish settlement a national value and not only encourages but protects it. Imagine an American law championing the U.S. as the nation-state of white people or even the nation-state of Christians. That would rightfully be understood as supremacist and undemocratic. In addition to this law, the State of Israel does not recognize an Israeli nationality, only Israeli citizenship. Jews are granted Jewish nationality, while minorities are assigned a national identity tied to their religion or ethnicity. Those without Jewish nationality are denied the rights and privileges reserved for Jews, as we'll explore further in the next segment. To preserve a Jewish state, the Zionist project depends on maintaining a Jewish demographic majority with as few Palestinians as possible. This is why Israel insists on defining itself as both Jewish and democratic. Democracy only functions so long as the Jewish majority is upheld, ensuring the state remains built primarily for Jews at the expense of the minorities within it. Put very simply, the principle of majority rule holds value in Israel only when the majority is Jewish. For this reason, through measures ranging from discriminatory immigration policies to outright ethnic cleansing and genocide, the State of Israel has remained fixated on preserving its Jewish demographic majority. Consider the phrase Israel's democratic Jewish character. What does it mean to speak of the democratic character of a state that has been determined by its Supreme Court to be the sovereign state of the Jewish people, including Jews in the diaspora, but not the state of its citizens? Recall that the Jewish character of the state is not merely symbolic. Discrimination against Arab citizens is far-reaching and deeply rooted in legal structure and administrative practice, including access to land, development funds, and virtually every aspect of social life, wrote Professor Noam Chomsky in The Fateful Triangle. In the 2011 book False Prophets of Peace, anti-Zionist Israeli activist Tikva Honig-Parnas argues that the supposed left-wing flank of Zionist intellectuals bears significant responsibility for maintaining the contradictory idea of Israel as both a Jewish and democratic state. By constructing a state where self-determination and national rights are reserved exclusively for Jewish people, she explains, any genuine democratic aspirations are negated from the start. She places most of the blame for this charade on liberal and left-wing Zionists, since their professed commitment to Enlightenment values and liberal democracy forces them to twist themselves into knots trying to present Israel as a democracy while it openly defines itself as a Jewish state. The right-wingers, on the other hand, don't really give a shit about liberalism or democracy in the first place, so their intellectuals rarely bother trying to reconcile the contradiction between Israel as an ethnocracy and Israel as a supposed democracy. In addition to how Israel treats its minorities, the state also silences dissenting voices regardless of their ethnicity. An example of this authoritarianism comes in the form of Israel's treatment of Jewish Israeli historian Ilan Pappé. Pappé is part of a group of academics known as the New Historians who emerged in the 80s with new information regarding Israel's foundation and the ethnic cleansing it committed in the process. Pappé is the most radical of the bunch and has been for the longest time. He calls for one democratic state with equal rights for all. Isn't that just the most radical thing ever? What a nut job this guy is. Anyway, Pappé, who was born and raised in Israel and taught at Haifa University, is no longer able to teach in Israel due to his support for an international academic boycott of Israeli institutions and his anti-Zionist worldview. The censorship campaign he was met with was so severe that not only was he expelled from Haifa University and unable to teach, but he is prohibited from entering Israeli high schools as well.
My writing led to strong pressure from the university on me to censor myself. And since I refused, I eventually was expelled from the University of Haifa in 2007. And I'm also barred from entering Israeli high schools and talk about these issues. I'm still an Israeli citizen, so I can go to Israel as a state. I'm not denied entry to the country, but I'm denied working as academic in the country.
Up to this point, I haven't even touched on the occupied Palestinian territories where Israel confines the population to Bantustan-like enclaves, divided by checkpoints and roadblocks, subjects them to military courts, and enforces daily subjugation. Palestinians in the West Bank are also regularly targeted by fanatical settler supremacists who operate with full protection from the Israeli military. Some defenders of Israel argue that, before 1967, the country was a democracy and that things only went to shit after the occupation of the Palestinian territories. But, as Elon Pape notes, Israel was never a democracy. Between 1948 and 1967, the state pursued a shoot-to-kill policy against Palestinians attempting to reclaim their land or crops, waged a colonial war to topple Nasser in Egypt, and routinely deployed trigger-happy security forces that would kill Palestinians. Many of the inhumane tactics that later applied in the occupied territories were honed over years within the Green Line, where Palestinians faced military rule and other systems of oppression dating back to 1948. The State of Israel, fundamentally sustained by ethnic cleansing, subjugation, and genocide, is not a democracy. Some liberal or left Zionists will openly admit that the conditions in the occupied Palestinian territories constitute apartheid. But they'll go on to insist that things are better inside Israel proper, where Palestinians supposedly enjoy equal rights and live in a democracy. But this is false. The next segment will tackle that argument. There is no apartheid in Israel proper, it's just in the occupied territories. The apartheid in the occupied territories is being carried out by Israel, and no matter how much one tries to separate Israel's actions within the Green Line, which is apartheid as well, from its actions in the territories, the regime enforcing apartheid is still Israel. Apartheid conditions are present throughout the entirety of historical Palestine. But first, let's take a step back and define apartheid. What exactly does the term mean, and how is it applicable to Israel? According to international law, notably the Rome Statute of the ICC and the 1973 Apartheid Convention, apartheid is an institutionalized regime, similar to apartheid South Africa, of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over another, involving inhumane acts such as denial of life, liberty, and other human rights with the intent to maintain this oppressive system. Basically, similar to how genocide is defined in international law, apartheid is when these inhumane acts, or ones similar to them, are carried out by one racial group that dominates another, while doing so with the intent to preserve that oppressive structure. You may have noticed the potential issue with this definition. It frames apartheid solely as a matter of racial domination. Bad faith actors often seize on this to argue that Israel cannot be committing apartheid since Palestinians and Jews are not racial groups.
For apartheid, in your definition, this is the one that you gave me, okay? You said that it was racial domination, and you're talking about national groups. So I'm trying to figure out what is the racial domination part. By your definition, by the original definition in South Africa, is racial domination. This doesn't sound like racial domination. I don't know what the apartheid part is when the definition that you gave is the racial domination part.
But international jurisprudence, legal precedent, and scholarly consensus all reject this line of argument. To quote from Amnesty International's "You Feel Like You're Subhuman" report, the concept of distinct biological races has been scientifically discredited, and there is now a wide recognition that race is a social construction with no basis in human genetics or biology. International courts have also since acknowledged that membership in a racial group is largely a subjective rather than an objective concept. Racial groups can therefore be considered as groups who are perceived as being different and possibly inferior by other groups on account of particular physical and/or cultural attributes. As Dr. Carola Lingas of the University of Oslo puts it in her book, The Concept of Race in International Criminal Law, the question of race is connected to the labeling and stigmatization of members of a group singled out by the perpetrator as targets of his criminal acts. The perpetrator dominates a group he considers and treats as inferior. The definition of the protected racial group depends on the perpetrator's perception thereof. She goes on to describe the concept of race in international law as an evolutive interpretation of the generic term race building on the perpetrator's perception of the victim group as pertaining to a distinct racial group. Such a subjective approach acknowledges that the racial group is largely created in the mind of the perpetrator. Likewise, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia noted in a report written by Professor Richard Folk and political scientist Virginia Tilley that, in the geopolitical context of Palestine, Jews and Palestinians can be considered racial groups. So according to scholarly findings and jurisprudence on the matter, the victimizer, in this case, the Zionist Israeli Jew, projects a racialized understanding onto the Palestinian and therefore creates the eligibility for apartheid as it is understood in international law. Moving on to the specific conditions and inequalities faced by the Palestinians in Israel proper, meaning the parts of historical Palestine outside the West Bank and Gaza, Professor Sari Makdisi argues that every single major South African apartheid law has a direct equivalent in Israel today. To back up his point, he points to the South African Population Registration Act of 1950, which assigned every South African a racial identity that determined their rights and privileges. This system is directly mirrored by Israeli laws that assign each citizen a distinct national identity. According to Israeli law, there is no such thing as Israeli nationality. As the High Court put it in the 70s, there is no Israeli nation separate from the Jewish people. So, Jewish citizens of the state are classified as having Jewish nationality, but non-Jews, although they can be citizens of the state, are explicitly not members of the nation, i.e., Jews all over the world, whether they want to be affiliated with Israel or not, whose state Israel claims to be. As a result, the national identity of the Palestinian citizens of Israel is denied and erased at every institutional level. Makdisi goes on to note that stripping Palestinian citizens of their national identity is not only merely degrading. In Israel, various fundamental rights, access to land and housing, for example, are attendant upon national identity, not the lesser category of mere citizenship. Thus, Jews who are not citizens actually have more rights than citizens who are not Jewish. In no other country on earth do racially privileged non-citizens enjoy greater rights than citizens and residents. He further highlights other parallels. South Africa's Group Areas Act of 1950, which segregated residential areas by race, finds its counterpart in Israeli land laws that bar Palestinians from living in Jewish settlements and from accessing state land, 93% of the country. Land expropriated from Palestinians after 1948. The Black Education Act of 1953, which enforced separate and unequal schooling for Black South Africans, has its equivalent in Israel's discriminatory education system. Out of 1,600 subsidized daycare centers, only 25 are in Palestinian towns. While over 80,000 Israeli children under 4 attend daycare, only 4,200 are Palestinian, when proportional representation would be more than 20,000. Israel spends over 3 times as much per Jewish student as it does for Palestinian one, excludes nearly all Palestinian towns from its top priority education list, and provides Jewish children far greater access to cultural programs and curricular opportunities. Similarly, South Africa's Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949 finds its parallel in Israel's lack of civil marriage, which forces Jews to marry only other Jews under Orthodox law. And apartheid-era past laws restricting Black South Africans' movement are mirrored in Israel's system controlling Palestinian mobility. And the list goes on. Under the 1958 Basic Law, the Central Elections Committee can disqualify a party or candidate from participating in elections if their objectives or actions are meant to negate the definition of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So for those who argue that Palestinians in Israel are allowed in the government and they can vote, yeah, until they try to challenge the ethno-supremacist character of the state that oppresses them, at which point they get kicked out. In fact, as Tikva Honig Parnas noted, Section 7A, added to the Basic Law in 1984, bars any political party and person that does not recognize Israel as a Jewish and democratic state from participating in parliamentary elections. Israel also engages in a cruel practice known as Judaization, which involves the removal and fragmentation of Palestinian enclaves within Israel. This often occurs in the Galilee, the Negev, or anywhere there is a significant concentration of Palestinians living inside the country. The major aim of Judaization of these regions has been to prevent the emergence of a social, political, economic nucleus among the Palestinians, wrote Parnas. The Israeli state often pursues these goals through inhumane demolitions and land seizures. In 1976, Israeli forces even shot and killed 6 Palestinians in the Galilee and confiscated land equal in size to central London. Now, it is true that the Israeli Basic Laws, which serve in the absence of a constitution because Israel doesn't have one, pay lip service to equality and human dignity. However, as Amnesty International points out, across all the basic laws, legal provisions on equality are subordinated to those that privilege Jewish Israelis and establish the State of Israel as Jewish. In fact, the basic law provisions on equality often only refer to discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation, disabilities, and the like, not anti-Palestinianism. Quoting from Amnesty International's report titled Israel's Apartheid Against Palestinians, Israel has also enacted specific laws, for example, on equal opportunities at work and equal opportunities for people with disabilities. Other protections against discrimination have been put in place through decisions by the Supreme Court. However, these decisions have focused on discrimination based on sex, sexual orientation, and distributive justice, and have not removed discrimination against Palestinian citizens of Israel that is based on their non-Jewish identity. The report also gives an example of how Israel's basic law on human dignity and liberty, which claims to protect human rights, ultimately places them beneath the state's Jewish identity. Attempts to amend the basic laws to guarantee equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel have been unsuccessful, on the express grounds that such attempts seek to deny Israel's existence as the state of the Jewish people. Remember what I told you about the definition of apartheid. There needs to be the intent to uphold these systems of domination, and there you have it on display for the world to see. The idea that Palestinians inside Israel enjoy equal rights or that they live peacefully on par with their Jewish neighbors is a joke. The Jewish population has long perceived Palestinians as an untrustworthy enemy from within. As Benny Morris put it, the Israeli Arabs are a time bomb. Their slide into complete Palestinization has made them an emissary of the enemy that is among us. They are a potential fifth column in both demographic and security terms. They are liable to undermine the state. So that if Israel again finds itself in a situation of existential threat as it did in 1948, it may be forced to act as it did then. If the threat to Israel is existential, expulsion will be justified. Keep in mind, Benny is often presented as a liberal, reasonable intellectual. What the fuck, man? As Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem puts it, the Israeli regime enacts in all the territory it controls an apartheid regime. One organizing principle lies at the base of a wide array of Israeli policies, advancing and perpetuating the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians. To conclude this segment, Israel, within the Green Line as well as in the occupied territories, controls Palestinian freedom of movement, demolishes their homes, seizes their land, Judaizes their communities, bars them from adequate political representation, and the list goes on. All actions that mirror those of apartheid South Africa and are prohibited acts under the Apartheid Convention. Just because conditions for Palestinians are worse in the occupied territories than inside the Green Line does not preclude the existence of apartheid. The domination of Palestinians doesn't need to be applied equally across all contexts. It can exist on a spectrum. The obsessive drive to maintain a Jewish majority through military and legal structures combined with inhumane acts of racial domination to enforce that reality demonstrates Israel's intent to uphold a supremacist project and constitutes apartheid. In the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel is the nation-state of the Jewish people, and theirs alone. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
I will not sit with anti-Zionists because anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
So no, it's actually not. Judaism has existed for thousands of years, while political Zionism only emerged in the late 1800s. So right off the bat, we can drop the idea that the two are inextricably linked. They're not. Funnily enough, the most ardent opponents of political Zionism at its inception were Jews themselves. Zionism was a fringe ideology within the Jewish community. It was only one inessential expression of Jewish cultural life, wrote Ilan Pappé, who explains that it reflected two impulses within the Jewish community. First, the desire to escape anti-Semitism in Europe, and second, the wish to emulate the nationalist movements of other Europeans by transforming Judaism from a religion into a nation. But if we roll back the clock even further, we find that the impulse to send the Jews elsewhere was originally pushed by European Christians, whom Pape refers to as proto-Zionists. These were often deeply anti-Semitic Christians who wanted Jews to move to Palestine for three main reasons. A, to trigger the second coming of the Messiah. Yes, this is actually something some evangelicals believe. B, to get Jews to leave their own countries because many didn't want them around. And C, to use Jews as regional allies in the Middle East. Zionism, as we can see, was therefore a Christian project of colonization before it became a Jewish one, Pape writes. Jews at large didn't buy into this idea till much later. As Professor Yuri Ram points out in his essay on Zionist historiography, Jews, secular and religious, needed to be persuaded to adopt Zionist ideology. They, at large, originally rejected the attribution of national significance to their cultural affiliation and considered the nations among whom they lived as their brethren, and the states in which they lived as their homelands. Notable anti-Zionist Jewish organizations include the Jewish Labor Bund, who believed that economic democracy, particularly socialism, would better serve to remedy the plight of European Jewry, and that the hyper-nationalistic and colonial nature of Zionism just would not help. Funnily enough, the Balfour Declaration, the British-authored document that declared the intention to set up a Jewish homeland in Palestine, was actually authored by a notorious Jew-hater, Arthur James Balfour, who, as the British Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, enacted the Aliens Act, which prohibited Jews fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe from finding safe haven in Britain. No wonder he was all for sending the Jews to Palestine. He hated them. Ironically, the most aggressive opponent of the Balfour Declaration within the British government at the time was Edwin Montagu. He believed Zionism was a foolish idea that would undermine the position of Jews who were already integrated into British society, and he referred to the Balfour Declaration and the officials who supported it as anti-Semitic. Oh, and he was the only Jew in the British cabinet at the time. Was he self-hating? Was he the real anti-Semite? Was he Hamas? On another note, conflating Zionism with Judaism ignores the fact that the majority of Zionists are Christian. There are more Christian Zionists in America alone than there are Jews on the planet. Oh, and AIPAC, the Zionist lobbying group everyone talks about with its unprecedented power in America, isn't even the biggest Zionist lobbying group in the US. That distinction goes to CUFI. You want to know what CUFI stands for? Christians United for Israel. So when I say that I'm anti-Zionist, all of those Christians are included. Not because of their Christianity, but because of their Zionism. In the same way, taking an anti-Zionist stance toward Jewish people isn't a denunciation of their Jewishness, but a critique of the political ideology of Zionism. Another pernicious aspect of conflating Jews with Zionists is that it inevitably alienates a substantial portion of Jews while simultaneously claiming to act in their best interest. It infantilizes and ridicules anti-Zionist Jews, and in some cases even casts them as a sort of fifth column, supposedly liable to undermine the Zionist movement. A stereotype of deceptiveness imposed on Jews that mirrors the very attitude of anti-Semites. As American biblical scholar Miller Burrows put it, Zionism is not Judaism. Those who oppose Zionism include a considerable body of Jewish people in the US. To label all opponents of Zionism anti-Semitists, one must regard all Jews who oppose Zionism as traitors to their own faith and people. The Zionists do just that. In their ardent efforts to identify Zionism and Judaism, they have put pressure amounting sometimes to real persecution upon Jews who do not espouse their cause. Until fairly recently, Reform Judaism was on the whole anti-Zionist. But of course, according to Zionists, these Jews are self-hating or suffering from survivor's guilt, as Jewish academic Noam Chomsky was once accused. Quoting from his book, The Fateful Triangle, it might be noted that the resort to charges of anti-Semitism, or in the case of Jews, Jewish self-hatred, to silence critics of Israel, has been quite a general and often effective device. Even Abba Eban, the highly regarded Israeli diplomat of the Labour Party, considered a leading dove, is capable of writing that one of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, generally understood as criticism of policies of the State of Israel, is not a distinction at all, and that Jewish critics, I.F. Stone and I are specifically mentioned, have a basic complex of guilt about Jewish survival. Leading figures of Zionism actually welcomed anti-Semitism since it served as proof of the supposed need for a Jewish state. Theodor Herzl famously put it bluntly, writing that anti-Semites would become Zionism's best friends and allies, giving the movement a convenient way to weaponize accusations of anti-Semitism to shield its own supremacist project. I can't be the only one who thinks that a political ideology which demands complete subservience from Jews lest they be ridiculed and branded as self-hating isn't really concerned with Jewish well-being, but with preserving its own power. In fact, when Mizrahi Jews began arriving in Israel after 1948, they were treated horribly by the white Ashkenazi establishment, dismissed as backward, bad human material, primitive, and even subhuman. As historian Avi Shlaim put it, Zionism was a European movement by European Jews for the benefit of European Jews. This conflation of Zionism with Judaism works to obscure the colonial reality of the ideology, first championed by anti-Semitic Christians and later entrenched by racist white Jewish Zionists who treated non-European Jews with contempt. In fact, some of the harshest vitriol directed at Jews has come from Zionists themselves. As Tikva Honig Parnas pointed out, many Zionists, particularly on the relative political left, have made a habit of distinguishing themselves from religious Jews by instead identifying with the nationalist qualifier, Israeli. They'll even scapegoat Judaism itself whenever it's politically convenient. Take the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. He was killed by a right-wing Zionist determined to block the already futile peace negotiations. Yet, the Zionist left quickly pinned the act on the assassin's religious background rather than his nationalist, maximalist political beliefs. Shlomo Ben-Ami, a left Zionist intellectual and former Israeli foreign minister, framed Rabin's assassination as a split between the Jew and the Israeli, attributing Rabin's murder to his assailant's Judaism rather than his Zionism. As Parnas noted, the rhetoric used by the assassin was a political Zionist rhetoric, not a religious one. He objected to Israel making territorial concessions to any Palestinian sovereignty, a position held by many non-religious Jews. His positions were not born of extreme religiousness, but rather from extreme Zionism. Nevertheless, his religious identity was presented as the central motive for the assassination. She goes on to point out that it was far more convenient for Zionists to blame the assassin's religious beliefs rather than his Zionism. If the issue was framed as religion, then Judaism could be thrown under the bus. But if it was accurately portrayed as Zionism, then Israel's entire project of ethno-nationalism would come under scrutiny, and that simply couldn't be allowed. In other words, the Zionists literally sacrificed Judaism in the name of nationalism. Now, I'm not telling you all this to paint Jewish people as the main victims of Zionism, because they're not even close. Framing them that way is incredibly disrespectful to the true victims of Zionism, the Palestinians, whose oppression and genocide directly fuel and benefit the Zionist project. But it's worth pointing out that Zionism harms Judaism too. This is not a point I'd normally emphasize due to the fact that it may inadvertently shift focus away from Palestinian suffering at a time when our priorities should be there. Still, when confronting the argument that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, it's worth remembering that Zionism, while undeniably giving Jewish people stolen Palestinian homes and land and benefiting them greatly in that regard, also fuels global animosity toward Jews, feeds into anti-Semitic tropes, and has harmed Judaism. There's no shortage of Zionists parroting straight-up Nazi logic about Jewish blood and supposed immutable Jewish traits. Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, literally used this kind of rhetoric to argue for a Jewish ethno-state. Zionism also alienates any Jew who refuses to fall in line, and it thrives on the very existence of anti-Semitism. As I mentioned earlier with that Herzl quote, at the end of the day, Zionism is a political ideology, while Jewishness is ethno-religious. It's also worth noting that the leading figures of political Zionism were overwhelmingly secular. Herzl, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion was openly atheist. I'll conclude with this. Being against an ethno-nationalist, supremacist ideology does not make you anti-Semitic. Anti-Zionists are not, simply by virtue of opposing Zionism, anti-Semitic. Palestinians who oppose Zionism do so because it oppresses, kills, and steals from them. They would fight their oppressors regardless of religion or ethnicity. There were even Palestinians who revolted against Ottoman rulers and governors when the Ottomans were the ones in charge. Were they being Islamophobic then? The explicit effort by Zionists to conflate Zionism with Judaism, to brand their nationalist project with Jewish symbols, to carve stars of David into the land they've flattened, has functionally transformed a symbol of faith into one of hate. This is far more harmful to Judaism than anything the anti-Zionist movement could ever do. With all that said, focusing on how Zionism affects Jews isn't really a line of argument that I care for. The truth is, even if Zionism had no drawbacks for the Jewish community, it would still be wrong because it kills Palestinians. There is no famine in Gaza. This is the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, simply known as the IPC scale. It's a multi-partner initiative and a tool used to gauge food security, among other things. And it's the global standard. It not only provides a framework for understanding food insecurity, but also informs the international response on how to save lives. According to the IPC's Famine Review Committee, Over 500,000 Palestinians in Gaza are in IPC Phase 5, famine, marked by starvation, destitution, and death. Another million plus are in Phase 4, and about 400,000 are in Phase 3, meaning crisis. And conditions are only expected to worsen and spread. Cindy McCain, head of the World Food Program, said that she's personally met mothers and children starving in Gaza, stressing, "This is real, and it's happening now." And she's far from the only authoritative voice to speak out on the matter. The WHO Director General described the situation as a preventable man-made famine. International legal experts, including those at the International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, argue that this famine is not just a byproduct of war, but a deliberate strategy by Israel. They claim Israel's policies amount to the war crime of using starvation as a weapon of war. With that out of the way, let's dive into specific arguments deployed to discredit the claim that famine is present in Gaza. Some people will point to a few Palestinians who don't appear to be starving while ignoring the many who are. Others even claim that heavier-set parents holding frail children are stealing the food meant for their kids. Now, this is obviously a disgusting and ignorant argument to make. Children starve faster than adults, they need more nutrition, and therefore the absence of it affects them worse. Their bodies are in a constant state of growth, and their immune systems rely on proper nutrition. The lack thereof can have potentially fatal outcomes. Also, famine doesn't affect everyone equally, and the presence of some non-starving people doesn't negate its existence. According to the IPC, famine occurs when at least 20% of households face a complete lack of food or basic needs, acute malnutrition exceeds 30%, and mortality rates surpass 2 per 10,000 per day, with starvation, death, and destitution clearly evident. In many historical famines, certain groups, particularly the wealthy, have been able to avoid the worst effects. The Irish potato famine is one example where the crisis disproportionately impacted the poor. Famine doesn't just mean no food, everybody starve. It means adequate nutrition is inaccessible for large swaths of the population. A sick historical irony, Ireland during the Great Famine was actually a food exporting country, yet the lower social strata were unable to access any. It's important to remember that preventing famine before it happens is crucial. That's why when us crazy advocates for the Palestinian plight warn about food scarcity and impending famine, it's worth paying attention. Once the human body reaches a true stage of starvation, recovery isn't as simple as just giving food. Doing so can trigger refeeding syndrome, which can be fatal. Intense starvation requires careful medical treatment, and in Gaza, starving people aren't receiving the care they need. Another common Zionist gotcha is, that child is suffering from a pre-existing condition, not starvation. All right, so Israel isn't just starving children, it's starving sick children. What's the point? People with pre-existing conditions might need more nutrition, not less, and the absence of it could affect them worse. This is not a rebuttal. Also, need I point out the similarities in logic between Israel apologists who deploy this argument and Nazi freaks who claim that Anne Frank died of typhus? Anne Frank died because of the Nazis. Starving Palestinians starve because of the Zionists. No amount of pre-existing conditions or comorbidities will change that. Hamas is stealing aid. Another common claim about the food shortage in Gaza is that Hamas is to blame. According to this argument, Israel supposedly allows aid into the Strip, but Hamas either steals and hoards it or sells it for profit. The only issue with this narrative is that not even Israeli officials can go along with such a blatant lie. There is absolutely no evidence to support the claim that Hamas systematically steals aid. In fact, Israeli officials actually claim that the UN's aid delivery system was effective at delivering relief to Palestinians in Gaza until it was undermined and replaced by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a US-Israeli death trap that breaches international norms pertaining to humanitarian aid since it merges political objectives with humanitarian goals, and is responsible for over 1,000 dead aid-seeking Palestinians who died by gunfire in the vicinity of their sites. On top of this, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation replaced the UN's network of over 400 distribution sites with a meager 4 militarized distribution sites. All throughout this genocide, Israel has asserted that Hamas is stealing humanitarian aid and has used that as a justification for restricting adequate aid from entering the Strip. Anyone with basic reasoning skills can see the flaw in this argument. If Hamas were indeed systematically stealing aid, which it's not, the logical solution would be to follow international law and allow unimpeded humanitarian aid into Gaza. If Hamas were really stealing and selling the aid, basic supply and demand principles would apply. Flood the Strip with aid, increase the amount of distribution sites, and the supposed market for it is undermined because the product is no longer scarce. But of course, None of this is happening. Funnily enough, when Netanyahu went to the media to defend Israel and claim that humanitarian aid is being allowed in, he openly admitted to violating international law. In his statement denouncing the UN and claiming it's lying about Israel, he said, "In any path we choose, we will have to continue to allow the entry of minimal humanitarian supplies. We have done this until now." Netanyahu doesn't seem to realize what he just admitted. According to international humanitarian law, Israel is obligated to facilitate unimpeded humanitarian access to the Strip, not just minimal supplies. There is, however, a militia operating within Gaza that is credibly accused of regularly stealing aid. It goes by the name the Popular Forces, and it operates in collaboration with Israel. Israel works with them because they are enemies of Hamas. Oh, and Yasser Abu Shabab, the group's founder, is an ISIS affiliate. Good job, Israel. Way to stick it to the terrorists. Hamas uses human shields. Israel loves to accuse Hamas of using human shields. It's a tired trope at this point. The claim has been recycled for decades, and plenty of investigations have looked into it. For example, during Israel's 2014 Gaza offensive, Amnesty International examined whether Hamas was actually engaging in the practice, and they found, quote, "No evidence at this point that Palestinian civilians have been intentionally used by Hamas or Palestinian armed groups during the current hostilities to shield specific locations or military personnel or equipment from Israeli attacks." It is true that Hamas has operated near civilians, but keep in mind, Gaza is tiny. They don't exactly have the choice to go build military bases out in the boonies miles away from their population. Israel, on the other hand, does have that option and still comes up short. When Iran retaliated against Israeli aggression earlier this year, Israelis themselves posted videos of Iranian rockets hitting military sites that were planted right in the middle of densely populated areas. In actuality, many Israeli military centers are situated near civilians when they just don't have to be. But let's get back to Hamas's supposed human shielding. For a practice that is supposedly so common for Hamas militants to engage in, why haven't we seen Israel provide sufficient, credible evidence to substantiate the claim? Why hasn't a reporter or a journalist been able to sufficiently corroborate this? In fact, many have done the complete opposite. The BBC's Jeremy Bowen, for example, claims he saw no evidence of such a practice. Israel loves this unsubstantiated accusation so much that they even threw it at Hezbollah during the 2006 war in Lebanon. Predictably, Amnesty International and other groups like Human Rights Watch found no evidence to back it up. In fact, there are cases where the Israeli army literally doctored footage to push the human shields narrative, like editing a video to frame a 21-year-old medic that they killed as a human shield for Hamas. Now, forget everything I said so far, because the reality is this. Even if Hamas were using human shields, that doesn't give Israel the right to shoot through them. Under international humanitarian law, one party breaking the rules doesn't free the other from its own obligations, like following the principles of distinction and proportionality. Even if Hamas really were human shielding, Israel deliberately killing the human shield is still unacceptable. At the end of the day, the human shield narrative is used to justify Israel's mass slaughter of Palestinians while dehumanizing them, reducing them to barbarians who would use their own men, women, and children as shields. According to scholars Neve Gordon and Nicola Peragini, Israel does this to legitimize the killing of Palestinian civilians. This also allows for the simultaneous portrayal of Israelis as enlightened and just by comparison. Which brings us to the next segment. Israel doesn't target civilians, it's the most moral army in the world. Building on the previous point about human shields, Israel is actually known to use them. A Guardian investigation, among others, found that Israel has used Palestinian children as human shields. And when the Israeli Supreme Court finally formally banned the use of Palestinians as human shields, the Israeli army had a hissy fit and appealed to reverse the ban, stating that the use of Palestinian human shields is useful for diffusing tense situations. In addition to this, the Israeli army has developed a brutal military strategy called the Dahiya Doctrine. Named after the Dahiya neighborhood in Beirut, it stems from the military operations Israel carried out during the 2006 Lebanon-Israeli war. The Dahiya Doctrine is essentially a strategy of deliberately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure in the hopes of pressuring whoever Israel is fighting, in 2006 that meant Hezbollah, to surrender. And in case you think this is some sort of conspiracy theory, Israeli military officials themselves have been open about its aims and purpose, with Colonel Gabi Saboni openly stating that the goal of the Dahiya Doctrine is to target economic interests and the centers of civilian power that support the organization Israel is fighting. The devastation of this military practice in Lebanon was clear. 15,000 homes destroyed according to the UN, 17,000 more damaged, 1 million people displaced, with the Israeli army officials admitting themselves, "What we did was insane and monstrous. We covered entire towns in cluster bombs." They even outright stated that they received top-down orders to flood southern Lebanon. Remind me again who the terrorists are? And Israel has gone on to use this doctrine in later military campaigns, specifically in Gaza. Human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, have reported that Israel deployed this same depraved strategy against civilians and civilian infrastructure during its 2008 to 2009 Operation Cast-Lead assault in Gaza. In fact, the organization makes it clear that Israel carried out this barbarism in civilian areas where there was no active fighting or threat whatsoever. Many of the neighborhoods Israel destroyed were already under its control, leading Human Rights Watch to conclude that there was, quote, "no lawful military justification for the destruction." And of course, the deliberate targeting of civilians, journalists, and medics during the current genocide in Gaza is a direct extension of this doctrine. Since 2023, about 230 journalists have been killed in Gaza, some even on live television as they reported from a hospital that Israel bombed not once, but multiple times. The Gaza genocide has been the deadliest episode for journalists ever, claiming more of their lives than the US Civil War, World Wars I and II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, Cambodia, Laos, Yugoslavia, and the war in Afghanistan combined. The IDF even has a dedicated unit for the expressed goal of falsely smearing journalists as Hamas members to justify their deaths when Israeli forces kill them. Let's quickly run through some more actions of the world's most moral army before we end this segment. There's the torture and sodomizing of Palestinian prisoners with metal rods in Israeli prisons, the sexual abuse of prisoners by IDF members caught on camera, the fact that the reckless genocidal Israeli conduct in Gaza has resulted in a civilian death rate of 83%. What are we doing here? Why are our governments supporting this country? The Hamas charter calls for the genocide of Jews. So no, it doesn't. The original charter from 1988 was very much problematic and anti-Semitic, but that doesn't exist anymore. And as Noam Chomsky reminds us,
the Hamas charter was written by maybe half a dozen people in 1988 at a moment of an extreme Israeli attack on Gaza. It has no status. They've repeated over and over again that it doesn't apply anymore.
I have to choose my words carefully since I'm from a country that doesn't protect free speech and designates Hamas as a terrorist organization. Ironically, it doesn't do the same for the terrorist state of Israel. So before we go any further, this YouTube channel does not support the targeting of innocent civilians, no matter who does it. I do not support terrorism, and that is one of the many reasons I've been such an ardent opponent of Israel and US foreign policy. With that out of the way, speaking strictly from an analytical perspective and without moralizing or interjecting my opinion, the 2017 Hamas Charter makes it very clear that their call is not to harm Jews, but to resist colonialism, a right recognized under international law, by the way. And this can be further evidenced by the fact that Hamas isn't known to carry out attacks outside of historical Palestine. Jewish Israeli historian Ilan Pappé has even gone on record arguing that he perceives Hamas to be a legitimate national liberation movement, despite how it's branded by the government. The framing of Hamas as though they are nothing more than mindless anti-Semitic barbarians is a framework strategically designed by Israel to dehumanize not only Hamas members, but all of Gaza for supposedly electing them. However, a scholarly report published by the U.S. Institute of Peace disputes the idea that Hamas is inherently unwilling to work out an agreement with Israel. The researchers highlight that Hamas has gradually modified its political platform over time and has consistently indicated a willingness to consider coexistence with Israel without formally recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish ethno-state. We need to understand that Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state is a dog whistle that explicitly negates the possibility of equal rights and relegates Palestinians to second-class citizenship in their own land. It's more than reasonable to not be okay with that. Hamas equals ISIS. So we're going to start speeding things up here for the sake of time, but as we've covered, Hamas is primarily concerned with national liberation while maintaining a dimension of religiosity. ISIS, on the other hand, is a transnational organization that seeks to establish a global caliphate and dismantle the international system. It views the nation-state system, including Palestinian nationalism, as a violation of Islamic law and an act of apostasy. Hamas and ISIS don't like each other, and their tactics and goals couldn't be more different. That's why ISIS carries out terror attacks worldwide, while Hamas focuses on occupied Palestine. As we've mentioned earlier, some of Hamas's enemies within Gaza are actually ISIS-affiliated, and ironically, Israel supports these anti-Hamas groups. In fact, Israel shows more tolerance for ISIS affiliates than for the group it supposedly equates them with. Hamas has command centers under hospitals.
They literally put fucking command centers under hospitals. That's not even debated.
This is one of the classic Israeli talking points used to justify the bombardment, siege, and raid on Palestinian hospitals. Take Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza, one of many cases where the US and Israel claimed Hamas was running a command center beneath it, using that as a justification for deadly raids and its destruction. But as Amnesty International noted, they have not seen any credible evidence to support Israel's claim that Al-Shifa is housing a military command center, and that the Israeli military has repeatedly failed to provide credible evidence for the allegation. BBC has also cast doubt on these Israeli claims, arguing that Israel has not produced any credible evidence to substantiate their claims or suggest that Al-Shifa was housing Hamas centers. The Guardian also reported that the supporting evidence Israel released fell short of the original command center's claim. To make things worse, former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak flat out said that the infrastructure under the Al-Shifa hospital was built by Israel. He still alleges that Hamas utilizes it, but as we've been over, Israel failed to provide credible supporting evidence for their claims. I tell you all this to make one thing clear. Israel lies through its teeth. There's no reason anyone should take its word when it justifies war crimes with claims about Hamas tunnels and bunkers. The idea that you bomb an entire hospital and kill the people in it to get to some supposed Hamas fighters in the basement is insane and disproportional. According to the Red Cross, one of the foremost authorities on interpreting international law, hospitals are off-limits in nearly all circumstances. The only exception is if they are being used in ways that fall outside the purview of their humanitarian purpose and are harmful to the enemy. Even then, Israel or any other aggressor must be absolutely certain of this before launching an attack. In case of doubt as to whether medical units of establishments are used to commit an act harmful to the enemy, they should be presumed not to be so used. Given the fact that Israel repeatedly fails to provide any evidence to back up their claims, it's safe to say these bombings did not occur in the absence of doubt and thus breach international law. It's important to understand that just because there might be Hamas militants in a hospital, that is still not enough of a justification to bomb and kill the medical teams and civilians in it. Not even close. In fact, according to the Geneva Conventions, Israel is required to give civilians and medics sufficient time to evacuate before attacking a hospital. According to doctors who have survived these Israeli war crimes, in many instances, patients have been too fragile to be moved and there is no safe or practicable escape route. To sum things up, hospitals have protected status under international law. It's unlikely a hospital will lose that status, but if it does, the attacker must be absolutely certain, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that it's being used in a way that falls outside of its humanitarian purpose. The burden of proof when it comes to revoking a hospital's protected status falls on the attacker. The attacker must also protect the innocent inside, give a clear and effective warning, and allow ample time to evacuate before conducting a strike. Israel has failed to meet all of those obligations. Palestinians train children from a young age to hate Jews. This is another common talking point that ultimately serves to dehumanize Palestinians and justify the targeting of their schools and children by framing their educational systems as anti-Semitic. This claim, shockingly enough, is heavily circulated by an Israeli organization called Impact SE, which has been exposed as being neither impartial or credible. In fact, an extensive EU-funded study by the George Eckert Institute looked at nearly 200 Palestinian textbooks and flat-out debunked the idea that they're filled with hate or violence. The researchers found that overall, the material follows the UNESCO standards. They only came across 2 anti-Semitic references, and even those were already removed from newer editions. On the flip side, the books actually emphasized values like tolerance, mercy, justice, and compassion, and UNRWA, which runs the schools, has made it clear that their curriculum framework is rooted in principles of neutrality, human rights, equality, and non-discrimination. Ironically, scholarly studies examining Israeli textbooks have found instances of problematic bias and depictions of Palestinians as primitive and dangerous while justifying past violence against them. All that said, can we stop with this weird purity test when it comes to how Palestinians view their oppressors? Expecting them simply to like or accept the people who colonized, murdered, stole from, and subjected them to apartheid is absurd. Just so happens that their oppressors in this case are Jewish. Palestinians didn't choose the religion of their tormentors. The idea that a supposedly flawed educational system is what breeds animosity in Palestinians as opposed to, the occupation, the checkpoints, overall restriction on movement, and the violence they are subjected to is ridiculous. The Gaza Ministry of Health is an arm of Hamas, likely inflating the reported death count. The Gaza Ministry of Health is a professional body staffed by medical professionals. Its legitimacy has been widely accepted in the past. Organizations ranging from the UN to Human Rights Watch all consider the GHM to be reliable and historically credible when documenting casualty numbers. It's very convenient that Israel just gets to blame everything on Hamas whenever it doesn't have a genuine rebuttal. A peer-reviewed analysis published by The Lancet not only found that the GHM was not inflating the death toll, but on the contrary, undercounted deaths due to traumatic injury by 41%. It's important to keep in mind, as I've mentioned earlier, the GHM numbers are likely a massive undercount due to all the bodies that have yet to be found under the rubble. The GHM only accounts for bodies that have been recovered. Israel is the West's greatest ally. This kind of builds off the trope that Israel is a democracy and the only one in the Middle East for that matter. However, Israel doesn't live up to any of the values that the West purports to uphold. Aside from the fact that the Enlightenment ideals Western liberals claim to value were rooted in many cultures long before their formalization in 17th century Europe, and that the West is notoriously inconsistent in applying its so-called humanistic beliefs to the developing world, Israel doesn't even make a pretense of upholding these liberal Western values. It's a theocratic ethno-state where privileges and rights are contingent on belonging to the preferred ethnic group. There is little separation of church and state, and no respect for human rights or international law. How then can this violent, rogue state be considered an ally of the supposedly enlightened West, let alone the so-called land of the free? Well, funnily enough, it wasn't always considered that strong of an American ally. According to political scientist Norman Finkelstein, from its founding in 1948 through the June 1967 war, Israel did not figure centrally in American strategic planning. It's true that America saw Israel as one of many regional allies, but up until 1967, U.S. administrations, specifically Eisenhower's, favored the Arab allies in the region. The Eisenhower administration even forced Israel to withdraw from Egypt when it invaded in 1956. Finkelstein points out that even American Jews at the time didn't really care all that much about Israel. Only 1 in 20 American Jews cared to visit Israel before June 1967. It wasn't really until Israel's victory in the 1967 Six-Day War that the U.S. stance changed, viewing Israel as a militarily strong force in the region, one that could better protect American interests. As Finkelstein notes, impressed by Israel's overwhelming display of force, the United States moved to incorporate it as a strategic asset. Already before the June War, the United States had cautiously tilted toward Israel as the Egyptian and Syrian regimes charted an increasingly independent course in the mid-60s. Military and economic assistance began to pour in as Israel turned into a proxy for U.S. power in the Middle East. In fact, as historian Rashid Khalidi noted, prior to this shift in American outlook, the U.S. would regularly vote against and condemn Israel at the UN. In conclusion, Israel is not an enlightened ally in any sense. While I would argue that the rest of the West also falls short of its professed ideals, the main point is this: don't mistake Israel's strategic position in the Middle East for being a beacon of liberal values or a genuinely humanitarian partner in the region. It's not. Israel only ever defends itself. The perpetual David versus Goliath. Israel's very existence as an ethnocracy, explicitly designed to function as a Jewish state rather than a state for all its citizens equally, is inherently offensive. It necessitates the removal and subjugation of non-Jewish populations who contradict the goals of Zionism. In this context, it is the Palestinians who are merely defending themselves. The Palestinians are not the ones who, with the help of wealthy organizations abroad and support from the world's superpowers, colonized another land, ethnically cleansed the locals, and subjected the remaining victims to apartheid. The Zionists did that. Palestinians never went to Israel. Israel came to them. With that out of the way, there are still countless examples of Israel blatantly aggressing not only against the Palestinians, but against many other countries in the region. They started a war with Iran earlier this year, invaded Egypt in 1956 to take control of the Suez Canal, and started the Six-Day War in 1967. According to Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and contrary to the popular Israeli myth that they had no choice, Israel deliberately chose to start that war, even though it wasn't necessary. Oh, and who could forget the deliberate ethnic cleansing campaigns of 1948 and beyond? Israel's mere existence as a state for one ethnic group exclusively is an act of offensive aggression. This all started on October 7th. Don't start a war you can't finish. Nope, the population in Gaza has been subjected to restrictions on movement, siege, blockade, and periodic killings for decades. Not to mention how so many people ended up in Gaza in the first place. The Gaza Strip is a region where Zionists crammed the Palestinian population who were ethnically cleansed from other parts of historical Palestine. It's common to hear Gaza characterized as an open-air prison, and this description is apt. Human rights organizations from Amnesty International to Israeli groups like Gisha have often stated that Gaza's population is subjected to collective punishment, which is a violation of international law. The economic devastation in Gaza is a direct result of Israeli policy, which controls everything that goes in, dictates how resources are managed, and blocks development. Note the date of this Gisha article. It came out months before October 7th, 2023. As economist and scholar Sarah Roy wrote, Israel has imposed quotas on the type and amount of raw materials that could enter the Gaza Strip for use in local manufacturing. Such quotas have particular significance for industry. They have enabled Israel to limit artificially the level of demand for and production of goods manufactured in the territories, thereby imposing clear structural constraints on the industrialization process. Exports from Gaza are hardly enough to build up the economy, and there are little job opportunities for the residents given they can't leave the Strip. Roy also notes how Israel imposed a one-way system of tariffs and duties on the importation of goods through its borders, leaving Israel for Gaza, however, no tariffs or other regulations applied. Thus, for Israeli exports to Gaza, the Strip was treated as part of Israel. But for Gazan exports to Israel, the Strip was treated as a foreign entity subject to various non-tariff barriers. This placed Israel at a distinct advantage for trading and limited Gaza's access to Israeli and foreign markets. Gazans had no recourse against such policies, being totally unable to protect themselves with tariffs or exchange rate controls. Thus, they had to pay more for highly protected Israeli products than they would if they had some control over their own economy. On top of this, since 2007, Israel has maintained strict control over Gaza's airspace and territorial waters, having already demolished Gaza's international airport back in 2001. The World Bank back in 2015 put out a report that stated that the 2007 blockade on Gaza was responsible for shaving 50% off its GDP, with unemployment in Gaza being the highest in the world at 43%, and youth unemployment at over 60%. According to UNCTAD, the decades-long Israeli policy on Gaza has hollowed out Gaza's economy and forced the population into a position of aid dependency. So, when Mr. Brainworms over here says shit like,
the Palestinian people are arguably the most pampered people by international aid organizations in the history of the world. Are you kidding me?
Remember, this is a population that wants to be productive, but has instead been deliberately de-developed and forced into dependence on international aid. Quoting from UNCTAD, between 2006 and 2022, Gaza's real GDP per capita shrank by 37%, while its share in the Palestinian economy contracted from 31% to 17.4%. The restrictions on movement also impede access to health and other essential services, as 80% of Gazans depend on international aid. Living in Gaza in 2022 meant confinement in one of the most densely populated spaces in the world, without electricity half the time, and without adequate access to clean water or a proper sewage system. It meant a 65% probability of being poor, 41% probability of dropping out of the labor force in despair, and for those looking for work, a 45% probability of being unemployed. As you've probably noticed, this UNCTAD reporting focuses primarily on the state of Palestinians in 2022, a year prior to when Zionists claim this all started. UNRWA has reported that in the years and months leading up to October 7th, 2023, 63% of Gaza's population was food insecure. Almost 82% of the population was living in poverty. Clean water was unavailable for 95% of the population. Electricity was only available for about 11 hours a day as of July 2023. This power shortage has severely impacted the availability of essential services, particularly health, water, and sanitation services, and continues to undermine Gaza's fragile economy. It probably doesn't help that the IDF regularly destroys Gaza's water wells that are used not only for drinking, but for farmlands as well, further contributing to the lack of clean water, with UNRWA reporting that in the years leading up to October 7th, 2023, 81% of water extracted from Gaza's aquifers failed to meet World Health Organization standards. And that's not even getting into the routine killing sprees Israel unleashes on Gaza. Episodes that have come to be dubbed mowing the lawn. Zionists also conveniently omit that 2022 was, at the time, the deadliest year for Palestinians in the occupied territories in recent history. Ignoring all of this and only zeroing in on Palestinian retaliation is a complete failure to view the situation holistically. Gaza has been deliberately de-developed by Israeli policy, so when Zionists claim it could have been a Singapore on the Mediterranean, remind them that the Gaza Strip is populated largely by refugees or descendants of those expelled during ethnic cleansing campaigns in other parts of Palestine. On top of that, Israel's cruel economic strangulation combined with recurring cycles of slaughter has precluded that possibility. The Palestinian Authority is the only acceptable Palestinian partner. The Palestinian Authority, or the PA, was created during the so-called Oslo peace process and was tasked with governing the Palestinian people. However, the PA has been nothing but an Israeli collaborator, policing its own people on behalf of the occupier. This has helped Israel keep the occupation cheaper and easier to manage, while putting a Palestinian face on the same old system of oppression. As Palestinian-American academic Edward Said commented about the PLO, and by extension the PA, it was, and still is, nothing more than Israel's enforcer. For more details on the PA, the Oslo peace process, and the carving up of the West Bank into 3 separate areas, make sure to check out this video of mine whenever you're done here. The PA is a cartoonishly unprincipled organization that Elon Pape called never wholly democratic and no stranger to significant corruption. As analyst Tanya Reinhardt noted, the PA has worked with Israeli forces and the CIA to brutally oppress and even kill its own people, who largely view the PA as collaborationist sellouts. In fact, the reason for the original popularity of Hamas was that they stood in opposition to those who were too compromising when it came to dealing with Israel. The idea that the PA is the only way forward sidesteps the aspirations of Palestinians who want real self-determination and sovereignty, not Israeli collaborators as their government. If Palestinians stopped fighting, there'd be peace. Aside from the fact that this argument blames the victims of settler colonialism rather than the settler colonists, no peace or genuine democratic coexistence can exist in a state explicitly designed to serve Jews alone. Under international law, resistance to colonial occupation is legal. As the American legal advocacy group, the Center for Constitutional Rights, put it, Israeli colonization of historic Palestine gives rise to the international legal right of colonized people to resist colonial domination and to pursue national liberation and self-determination. Under international law, armed groups such as Palestinian resistance fighters can lawfully carry out attacks on military targets. The solution is not to request that Palestinians refrain from exercising their internationally recognized legal right, but to call for the complete de-Zionization of the state, repatriation, and reparations for those harmed. A two-state solution is the only way forward. This isn't the first time in history we've faced such an impasse. The situation in apartheid South Africa was strikingly similar. The majority of white South Africans rebuked the idea of one democratic state, but nonetheless, apartheid eventually ended, and I doubt any of us who aren't outright racists would argue that this was the wrong decision. As Palestinian-American journalist, and in my opinion, one of the most important voices on the matter, Ali Abu Nima, put it, what if the ANC and other South African liberation organizations had only advanced political demands that whites told pollsters they would accept? In fact, until close to the end of apartheid, the vast majority of whites, including many of the system's liberal critics, overwhelmingly rejected a one-person, one-vote system, predicting that any attempt to impose it would lead to a bloodbath. See, we don't need to look that far into the past to see a nearly perfect analog of what we're dealing with today. Today, Jewish Israelis, whether left or right-wing, overwhelmingly reject the idea of one person, one vote throughout the entirety of historical Palestine. And in the same way the Afrikaners did, they portray the indigenous peoples as barbaric and eager to enact retribution on their colonizers. White South Africans would point to the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya or Congo post-independence and conjure up these narratives of indigenous black Africans as savage and uncivilized, yet once South Africa lost its international legitimacy and apartheid came to an end, whites lost the will to maintain a system that relied on repression and violence and rendered them international pariahs. They negotiated a way out and lived to tell the tale. It all happened much more quickly and with considerably less violence than even the most optimistic predictions of the time. But crucially, this outcome could not have been predicted based on what whites said they were willing to accept. And it would not have occurred had the ANC been guided by opinion polls rather than the democratic principles of the Freedom Charter. wrote Abu Nima. Now, with that historical parallel out of the way, I want to make the case against the two-state solution on both moral and pragmatic grounds. The moral arguments are plenty and straightforward. Forcing a partition onto a native population is stupid and unjust. But shoehorning a whole new European culture into the Levant, while simultaneously belittling and resenting Palestinians and Mizrahi Jews for turning Israel into a Levantine state, is absurd. Keep in mind that at the time of partition, Jews made up about a third of the population and owned less than 7% of the land, yet were offered more than half of Palestine by the UN plan. In addition to these unfavorable specifics, in the decades leading up to partition, Zionist settlers economically ostracized the native Palestinians through instruments such as the Histadrut, their trade union organization. Palestinians had their labor and goods barred from the market, forcing them into economic and political subjugation, and they were evicted from the land and farms they had made fruitful for generations. They had every right to be against partition, especially a partition with such a hostile colonizing force. Aside from this, I don't want to live in a world where ethnic contentions are resolved by carving out little ethno-states. It's rich how so many supposed liberals are fine with this idea, even though it clearly contradicts the Enlightenment ideals and liberal principles of pluralism and tolerance they claim to uphold, however inconsistently. With that out of the way, there are plenty of practical arguments against a two-state solution. It's funny because two-staters often accuse one-staters of being idealistic or utopian, unable to think pragmatically, but I'd argue that resolving this issue in any way other than one democratic state with reparations for Palestinians is what's truly unrealistic. First and foremost, the Zionists never cared to respect the partition plan that proposed them a state in the first place. Remember the letter Ben-Gurion wrote to his son that we talked about earlier? In it, he openly admitted that going along with partition was merely a way to gain international legitimacy, and that his real goal was the possession of all of Palestine. Keep in mind, Zionism is self-admittedly a colonial project. Take a look at the Biltmore Conference of 1942. We can see Zionists literally bragging about how they have written a notable page in the history of colonization. They were very proud and open about the fact that their movement was a colonial one. Aside from this, the Zionists' lack of genuine interest in implementing a true two-state solution became incredibly clear throughout the so-called peace process of the 90s and early 2000s, when ostensibly left-wing Israeli Dove leaders took the reins in a series of negotiations and plans to create a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. However, this entire process was a sham. I recommend watching this video of mine where I go into detail not only about the Oslo peace process, but all the supposed peace negotiations between Zionists and Palestinians, showing how the Israelis were the truly intransigent ones all along. But to summarize, during the nominal peace process of the 90s, the West Bank was carved into three separate areas, A, B, and C. Only Area A, which made up a meager 18% of the West Bank, was allowed to be governed completely by the Palestinian Authority, a collaborationist group that Israel created to subcontract the occupation. We touched on them briefly earlier in this video. It's also worth noting that Israel routinely performs raids in Area A and completely disregards whatever sovereignty the PA pretends to have, though that shouldn't be much of a shock to anyone. Throughout the peace process, illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank continued to grow unabated and were de facto annexed by Israel. In fact, the settler population in the occupied territories had more than doubled by the year 2000. These settlers regularly harass and torment Palestinians. The settlements are illegal under international law, yet the Israeli military protects them. Not exactly a formula conducive to a two-state peace plan. Even when land swaps were proposed, they were always lopsided and unfair. A prime example is Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak's supposedly generous offer of 2000, where he wanted to formally annex illegal Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory, offering Palestinians an extremely unequal deal in return. The ratio was roughly 9-1. Israel would get 9% of the already shrunken West Bank, including valuable areas, while Palestinians were offered just 1% of land within the Green Line. Unspecified land at that. In addition to these unjust land swap proposals, Barak also wanted Israeli control over the fertile Jordan Valley, denying Palestinians the ability to control their own border with Jordan for 99 years. The UN affirmed right of return for Palestinians, stating that they can go back to the homes that they were violently kicked out of, was denied. The future Palestinian state was denied the ability to have a military. Illegal Israeli settlements in East Jerusalem weren't even up for discussion. Israel would keep control over Palestinian airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum. What the fuck is this? Keep in mind, This was framed as if it were the most generous offer imaginable. In reality, it only proves once again that whatever peace plans the Israelis have up their sleeves, they are not interested in a just solution. Even Obama's Secretary of State, John Kerry, said back in 2013 that the window for a two-state solution was shutting. Keep in mind, this dude was literally tasked with keeping up this charade. At the end of the day, the two-state solution and the so-called peace process were never truly aimed at securing justice or sovereignty for the Palestinians. Instead, they have left behind fragmented, disconnected Palestinian enclaves separated by segregated roads, checkpoints, and barriers, while Israel retains full control over the airspace, borders, resources, economy, and the Palestinians' freedom of movement. You're telling me that this shit show is somehow a more realistic solution than simply implementing one democratic state between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean with repatriation and substantial reparations for the Palestinians. There already is one state in Palestine. It's controlled by Zionists who sustain it through apartheid and genocide. Even if a two-state solution were established, the new Israeli state would still obsessively work to maintain a Jewish demographic majority through military force and legislation. That's still an ethno-state, just one occupying a portion of historical Palestine instead of all of it. Should South Africa have created a separate state out of the Bantustans? Or was it better to abolish apartheid entirely? At the end of the day, the Zionists decided to forcibly form this ethno-state in a region where they are a small minority. As Abu Nima wrote, Israeli Jews do not have a choice about their minority status within historic Palestine. Unless they resort to mass expulsions of Palestinians, something sizable minorities of Israelis nonetheless support, the demographic facts are given. Their choice is about how to deal with this reality, whether through building higher walls to shore up an ethnic state or seeking a radically different form of security without walls. Jewish people live in democracies all over the world as minorities and are safer there than they are in present-day Israel, a state that claims to exist to keep Jews safe, yet simultaneously requires mandatory conscription, an Iron Dome, bomb shelters, and billions of US dollars yearly just to protect itself from the people it perpetually oppresses who inevitably retaliate. If Jews can live peacefully as a minority in Germany, the state responsible for acts of anti-Jewish brutality that no Arab or Muslim country comes close to, they can live as protected minorities in a democratic state in Palestine. The only reason one would think otherwise is if they hold racist beliefs about the perceived civility of Arabs. The alternative to a democratic Palestinian state is to continue this neo-fascist, murderous Zionist project, which has done nothing but bring death and destruction to the region. Israel has a right to exist. No state has the inalienable right to exist. People do. In this situation, the only people whose existence is being threatened are the Palestinians. States come and go. Where's the USSR? Where is Yugoslavia? Where did they go? Why did no one step in to protect their right to exist? The Soviet Union's existence was never really respected by the West, which constantly sabotaged it to bring about its destruction and even invaded the region during the Russian Civil War to prevent its existence altogether. What about Cuba? If states had a guaranteed right to exist, the US embargo, invasion, and bombings would violate it. What about states that forfeit their legitimacy, like the Third Reich or fascist Italy? Those states had to be dismantled and reconstructed in a different way. No state has an imprescriptible right to exist. Get over yourself. This slogan is only used to defend Israel when it comes under fire for actions that would revoke the legitimacy of any other state that acted similarly. Hamas should release the hostages if they want this to end. So first things first, the Israeli government doesn't give a fuck about those hostages. Sorry. According to Family Forum's ex-spokesperson, Chaim Rubenstein, it's Netanyahu who's been preventing a deal, and Hamas actually offered the hostages back as early as October 9th, 2023, in exchange for Israel abstaining from entering the Strip. And this is a pattern that has been repeated ad nauseum since the genocide began. Hamas has consistently offered to release the hostages. If we focus just on this year, 2025, we can see that not only has Hamas offered to cooperate and reach an agreement for the release of the hostages and a ceasefire, but Israel has walked away from or refused to cooperate time and time and time and time again. According to DropSite's own investigative journalist, Jeremy Scahill, Israel unilaterally withdrew from the January 2025 ceasefire and exchange of captives deal endorsed by both Biden and Trump. Hamas has repeatedly offered to return to the January deal or to negotiate a new one that would include releasing all Israeli captives at once. Hamas has made it clear it will entirely relinquish governance of Gaza in return for an independent technocratic committee. Israel has sabotaged or rejected all of these offers. On August 18th, Hamas accepted an agreement based on the US-Israeli drafted Witkoff framework, and offered major concessions. Israel has still not formally responded. The Trump administration now says it wants to reach a comprehensive deal, including the release of all Israeli captives at once. Hamas has reiterated its readiness to negotiate such an agreement immediately. It has also said that it is also prepared to move forward with the US-Israeli crafted agreement it accepted on August 18th. Now let's talk about all the Palestinian hostages being held in Israel. Thousands of Palestinians in Israel are held on dubious security concerns and are not offered fair trials, a practice that amounts to arbitrary detainment. They're brought before military courts with a near 99% conviction rate. These aren't criminals, they're penalized because Israeli forces label them security threats. These security prisoners are treated horribly, with even the Israeli High Court ruling that they're being underfed. Israeli forces are also notorious for physically and sexually abusing Palestinian prisoners, and when Israeli forces are told to stop doing that, Israeli mobs riot for the right to do so without punishment. I don't know what the hell is going on over there. Another example of the IDF not giving a damn about their own hostages comes from incidents like these. Israeli forces shot and killed hostages who were waving white flags. This doesn't just show a disregard for human life in general, it also highlights their callousness in distinguishing who they target, whether it's innocent Palestinian civilians or even their own people. Palestinians are homophobic, while Israel is so progressive. This is a tired, overplayed trope about Palestinians that reduces them to a monolith and erases organizations like Al-Qaz, a Palestinian group that advocates for queer rights, among other things. Queer liberation is absolutely something worth striving for, but pretending that Palestinians are uniquely conservative is just an obfuscation tactic. It's called pinkwashing, using a social cause, often LGBTQ issues, to distract from a larger injustice. The Israeli government does this masterfully. As academic Joseph Massad has pointed out, the Israeli government and its propaganda organs insist on advertising and exaggerating its recent record on LGBT rights to fend off international condemnations of its violations of the rights of the Palestinian people. This isn't even something that should need explaining, but Palestinians are a little preoccupied at the moment. Queer liberation usually flourishes in post-scarcity environments, not as a strict rule, but typically. If Zionists really wanted to see a thriving queer liberation movement in Palestine, they'd stop bombing and killing the very advocates who would be leading it, along with everyone else. But of course, Israeli officials don't actually care about LGBTQ rights. Israel still doesn't have gay marriage. They'll recognize it, but you gotta do it somewhere else. Same goes for interfaith marriage. That's why so many Israelis go to Cyprus to get married. This is not exactly a progressive society. Funnily enough, the ones who enacted the original anti-sodomy laws in Palestine weren't the Palestinians. It was the British. Regardless, this is such a dumb talking point that it feels silly to spend too much time on it. At the end of the day, conservative beliefs are found everywhere, especially in countries like the US at the moment. Should we be bombing Alabama or Wyoming because there might be some transphobes or homophobes there? Of course not. Palestinians don't exist. They're just Jordanians and Egyptians. I've covered this many times, but in summary, Palestinians are not just Egyptians, Jordanians, or anyone else. They have their own dialects, customs, rituals, nationalist and secularist movements, and unique political consciousness. It's also worth noting that the modern concept of a nation-state is relatively new and often weaponized to delegitimize the Palestinian liberation movement by claiming that Palestine was never a state. But denying self-determination to a distinct national group like the Palestinians on the basis of an anachronism is just lazy. It's also really funny that the person who popularized this talking point about Palestinians not being a thing was Golda Meir, a Ukrainian woman who had the gall to tell the people her project displaced that they never existed. But I'll entertain this delusion for a quick second and rattle off some historical references to Palestine. There's the famous reference made in Shakespeare's Othello. There's the reference made by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus in the 5th century BCE. And even earlier than that, we could see Egyptians using a cognate to the word Palestine back in the 13th century BCE. To wrap this section up with a quote from historian Nur Mashala, it can be shown empirically and based on material and documentary evidence that the name Palestine is continuously and uninterruptedly found in ancient, medieval, and modern histories and historical sources, including A. Ancient Egyptian and Assyrian inscriptions and texts, B. Classic Greek texts and literature, C. Roman and Byzantine administrative divisions of the region and sources, D. Medieval Arabic and Islamic Arabic sources on Palestine, E. Modern Hebrew, F. in all modern European languages and sources. It feels shitty that a video like this even has to be made, that there are figures who even claim to be on the political left who are so callous in their coverage or lack thereof when it comes to Palestine. Again, maybe they genuinely believe in Zionism, maybe they're monetarily disincentivized to speak out, maybe they're just apathetic. At the end of the day, whatever their reasoning may be, they all serve the same purpose, and it's not a good one. To quote Kurt Vonnegut's Mother Night, "We are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful about what we pretend to be." This is usually where I'd plug my Patreon or something similar, but I want to take this opportunity to share my friend Mohsen's story. He and his family of 23 are navigating the ongoing genocide in Gaza and could really use our support. I've been in frequent contact with him and his campaign manager, and I know for certain that these contributions really do make a difference. Mohsen is a genuinely selfless person who, despite his own circumstances, does everything he can to help others. If you are in a position where you're able to help, please consider doing so. You can find his campaign below. Thank you.